Hello, today Road to GH will reveal about as soon as Elizabeth stepped into Portia's office to confront her and finally uncover the full truth, she was immediately struck by the startling transformation in the woman she had long perceived as her fierce adversary. Gone was the confident, poised, and unyieldingly proud Portia who had once stood firm against any challenge. Instead, sitting before Elizabeth was a visibly shaken woman, her shoulders slumped, eyes swollen from sleepless nights, and hands nervously gripping the edge of her desk. Portia seemed to have aged years overnight, a stark reflection of the emotional turmoil she was undoubtedly experiencing. Elizabeth felt her heart constrict at the sight. The last remnants of resentment she had harbored toward Portia dissolved rapidly, replaced entirely by compassion. Tentatively approaching the woman she'd so long battled, Elizabeth gently asked Portia what exactly had happened. With visible reluctance, Portia slowly began to speak, her voice trembling with bitterness and shame as she recounted her desperate ordeal. Elizabeth listened intently, silently encouraging Portia to trust her enough to reveal the truth she'd hidden so deeply. When Portia finally admitted the shocking reality, that it was not Brad alone who was behind the vicious blackmail, but Drew himself, Elizabeth felt as though the room around her had suddenly tilted violently. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, causing her breath to catch sharply in her throat. Drew. The name echoed harshly in her mind, bringing with it memories she had deliberately buried deep within herself, gentle touches, whispered promises, and profound trust she'd placed unreservedly in the man she once deeply loved. Elizabeth struggled to reconcile the Drew she had known, the kind, principled, and empathetic man who once represented everything good in her life, with this cruel, manipulative figure Portia was describing. It felt unreal, impossible even, to associate the tender-hearted Drew of her memories with the ruthless villain capable of exploiting a terrified mother by using forged test results as leverage. Elizabeth's mind frantically tried to make sense of it, fighting against the harsh reality that Drew had apparently changed so drastically and dangerously in the time they'd been apart. Yet, despite her initial shock and disbelief, Elizabeth found herself unable to deny the unsettling rumors she'd been hearing about Drew over recent weeks. Friends and colleagues had quietly expressed concerns, hinting at darker aspects of Drew's recent behavior, actions that seemed far too ruthless for the man she'd once loved. Elizabeth had dismissed these whispers as idle gossip before, choosing instead to hold on to the comforting illusion of Drew's inherent goodness. Now, faced directly with Portia's stark confession, Elizabeth felt an undeniable fear creeping into her heart. She couldn't help but wonder what else Drew was capable of, how far he might go to achieve his goals, and whether she had ever truly known him at all. Portia, sensing Elizabeth's internal struggle, met her eyes with a desperate plea for understanding. Elizabeth saw clearly in that moment that Portia was no longer her adversary, but rather another victim caught in Drew's dangerous game. Elizabeth knew she couldn't walk away, not now, when Portia clearly needed support more than ever. Gathering her strength and suppressing her own doubts and fears, Elizabeth reached out, gently reassuring Portia that she believed her and would stand by her, no matter what happened next. As Elizabeth spoke those words, she felt a weight lift slightly from Portia's shoulders. They were now unexpectedly united, bound together not by past conflicts or bitterness, but by shared vulnerability and mutual determination to protect those they loved. Elizabeth silently vowed that, regardless of how painful or dangerous confronting Drew would be, she would not allow him to destroy any more lives. It was clear to Elizabeth that the battle ahead was inevitable, but for the first time, she felt fully prepared to face it, armed not with anger, but with unwavering courage born from compassion and loyalty. Elizabeth never imagined that a simple, unexpected meeting with Lucas could completely upend her life in such a dramatic way. When she casually walked into the small coffee shop, she only anticipated a light-hearted conversation catching up with an old friend, perhaps exchanging a few smiles and gentle jokes. But the second Lucas began speaking, the world around her abruptly collapsed into chaos. His voice was tense, cautious yet unmistakably disturbed, as he revealed the shocking truth. Brad had been blackmailing Portia with falsified test results provided by Heather. In an instant, Elizabeth felt her stomach twist sharply, a sickening sensation spreading through her body. The familiar warmth of the coffee shop suddenly vanished, replaced by a chill she couldn't shake off. Her mind immediately flashed back to those bitter confrontations she had endured with Portia, harsh encounters filled with painful accusations and relentless hostility. Portia had openly blamed Elizabeth for the mysterious Digitalis-related death, turning the entire hospital against her, ultimately resulting in her humiliating suspension. Elizabeth vividly recalled the icy glare in Portia's eyes, the uncompromising certainty with which she had judged her, and the overwhelming sense of injustice that had haunted her for weeks. Yet, to Elizabeth's surprise, her first instinct this time wasn't anger or resentment. Instead, a deep, unexpected wave of empathy crashed through her heart. She found herself picturing Portia's face again, but now she saw beyond the hostility, beyond the cold accusations, to the desperation hidden beneath. Elizabeth understood too well the lengths to which a mother would go to protect her child. She herself had walked that thin, painful line many times, willing to risk everything she had, her reputation, her dignity, even her own safety, if it meant her children were safe. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten painfully as she considered how isolated and terrified Portia must feel right now, trapped in Brad's web of manipulation, forced into silence by the weight of a potentially devastating scandal. Her anger toward Portia faded further with every heartbeat, replaced instead by a growing determination to offer help and support. Elizabeth knew all too well what it meant to be alone, accused, and misunderstood. She knew how it felt to endure the crushing loneliness and desperation that came with fighting a silent battle no one else understood. Sitting across from Lucas, Elizabeth carefully steadied her trembling hands, resolved now to take action. She would no longer allow the bitter shadows of their past conflict to define her decisions. Regardless of Portia's earlier cruelty, Elizabeth knew in her soul she couldn't simply stand aside. This was no longer about personal grudges or wounded pride, it was about compassion, about the shared pain that united them as mothers. Elizabeth decided right then and there, without hesitation, that she would confront Portia directly, extending an unexpected hand of support, fully aware that by doing so, she was stepping into a storm of complications that could threaten her own fragile position even further. But Elizabeth no longer cared about the risks. She felt strangely liberated, driven by a newfound courage born from empathy rather than resentment. She stood, thanked Lucas softly for his honesty, and walked out into the cold, determined to face whatever consequences awaited her. Whatever happened next, she would not let Portia face this nightmare alone. Du van chua het dao long sao kai by din chi tsong vik, Elizabeth and han chong quiet din dung ve phia Portia. Ko hu rang, han ai het, chin ko kung tung lam tat ca de bao vien hung dua con qua min. Elizabeth quiet din se truck teep doi dien voi dru, du beat de la mot han dong mao him. Portia can bao Elizabeth v ban chat lan lung va tuk dung qua dru hien tai, and hung Elizabeth van quiet tom Thursday suc. As Elizabeth delved deeper into Drew's recent activities, each conversation she had with Carly sent fresh waves of disbelief and dismay crashing through her heart. Carly, visibly troubled, revealed details Elizabeth could never have imagined, dark secrets and ruthless manipulations Drew had carefully hidden behind the charm she once knew so intimately. With every new revelation, Elizabeth felt increasingly stunned, struggling to accept that this cold-hearted individual was truly the same man who had once been so gentle, so deeply compassionate and above all, so trustworthy. She vividly remembered Drew as someone who had always valued integrity above personal gain, who would never dream of deliberately hurting another person to further his own ambitions. Yet now, every story Carly shared painted a disturbing new portrait, one of a calculating, ambitious man who had abandoned his morals without hesitation. Carly's voice shook with barely restrained anger as she detailed incidents Elizabeth hadn't previously known about, colleagues blackmailed into silence, friends betrayed without remorse, and innocent lives ruined by Drew's relentless quest for control. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken and her stomach churn with nausea as Carly recounted one particularly cruel incident involving Drew, an innocent employee at the hospital, and a vicious smear campaign that left careers shattered. It was almost impossible for Elizabeth to comprehend the level of cruelty Drew was capable of. The man she once loved had clearly been replaced by someone altogether different. Someone dangerously unrecognizable. Carly, observing Elizabeth's stunned expression, gently squeezed her hand, understanding the emotional toll this truth was taking. Elizabeth realized that Carly, too, felt deeply betrayed by Drew's transformation, but for Elizabeth, this betrayal was even more personal, more devastating. That night, alone at home, Elizabeth paced restlessly, her thoughts tangled in confusion and disbelief. The image of Drew's smiling face haunted her, mocking the naive trust she had placed in him. Her heart ached as she considered the possibility that perhaps she had never truly known him at all, that the Drew she had loved was nothing more than an illusion. Tears of frustration and sorrow welled up in her eyes, but Elizabeth quickly wiped them away, determined not to fall apart. In the quiet solitude of her living room, she made a firm decision. She would no longer allow Drew's actions to go unchallenged, regardless of the emotional price she might have to pay. Elizabeth knew that confronting him directly would be difficult, even painful, but she also knew she had no other choice. She was no longer the vulnerable woman who once depended on Drew's reassurance or approval. Instead, she had grown into someone stronger, a mother fiercely committed to protecting those around her from harm. As Elizabeth prepared herself mentally for the confrontation, she felt a renewed sense of clarity and courage. Her earlier confusion was now replaced with determination, a powerful resolve forged from compassion and justice. She dressed purposefully, stood tall, and steadied herself, acknowledging that she was about to confront someone who had once held her heart, but who now posed a clear and present danger to others. When Elizabeth finally arrived at Drew's doorstep, she took a deep breath, straightening her spine and lifting her chin defiantly. She was no longer intimidated by the mere thought of challenging Drew, nor did she fear whatever hostility or cruelty he might direct her way. In that moment, Elizabeth felt empowered, not as a woman bound by memories of love, but as a fearless protector driven by the instinctive strength of motherhood. Drew had drastically changed, but Elizabeth had evolved too. Her once fragile heart was now shielded by a resilient courage that refused to be silenced or manipulated. Elizabeth knocked firmly on Drew's door, prepared to confront the man he had become, determined to hold him accountable, and ready to face whatever storm lay ahead. Elizabeth stood firmly before Drew, her voice steady and unwavering as she refused to allow herself to be intimidated by the unfamiliar hardness that now shadowed his gaze. She knew precisely how difficult this confrontation would be, especially given their complicated past and the tenderness that had once defined their relationship. But Elizabeth recognized that sentimentality had no place here, not anymore. The man she once loved was hidden somewhere beneath layers of greed and ambition, and it was her responsibility, her mission, to peel back those layers and force him to confront his own humanity again. Drawing a careful breath, Elizabeth began speaking with calculated precision, using words that she knew would strike Drew at his emotional core. Her eyes met his, daring him to look away as she reminded him of Scout, the innocent daughter he loved so deeply. Elizabeth's voice softened slightly when she spoke of Scout, knowing that the mention of Drew's child would immediately pierce the protective armor he had built around his heart. She spoke about the precious innocence Scout still possessed, innocence that Drew himself had sworn countless times he would fiercely protect, no matter the cost. But Elizabeth didn't stop there. She knew the mere mention of Scout might stir Drew's conscience, but to fully awaken the empathy he had buried, she had to dig deeper, even at the risk of reopening old wounds. Gathering her strength, she began to speak softly but pointedly about Oscar, the beloved son Drew had tragically lost, whose memory still lingered like an eternal, aching shadow in Drew's soul. Elizabeth carefully recalled the profound pain and helplessness Drew had felt, the overwhelming grief that had once nearly consumed him. Her words were precise, deeply personal, and raw, each carefully chosen sentence intentionally reminding Drew of the agony of losing someone he loved so completely and irrevocably. She described how Portia, in her desperation and fear, now stood exactly where Drew himself had once stood, teetering on the brink of a devastating loss. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger, her tone sharpening with intensity, forcing Drew to understand that he was deliberately inflicting the same type of pain he had struggled so desperately to overcome himself. She urged him to imagine, even for one moment, the fear gripping Portia's heart, the terrifying helplessness of a parent trying to shield her child from danger, much like Drew himself had once desperately sought to protect Scout and Oscar. Elizabeth's piercing words seemed to slowly chip away at Drew's carefully maintained composure. His expression shifted subtly, a flash of vulnerability briefly breaking through the cold mask he had adopted. She saw the subtle hesitation in his eyes, a quiet internal battle raging beneath the surface as her words resonated deeply within him. Elizabeth felt a glimmer of hope in that moment, a tiny flicker of recognition that perhaps the Drew she once knew, the Drew who was capable of kindness, empathy, and profound love, might still exist beneath the ruthless exterior he now presented. Yet, despite witnessing his momentary wavering, Elizabeth remained cautious. She knew better than to let herself be convinced too quickly that Drew would abandon his cruel plan. The man standing in front of her was now unpredictable, dangerously calculating, and deeply entrenched in his own ambitions. Elizabeth understood that while she might have succeeded in cracking Drew's facade, convincing him to truly abandon his scheme would require far more than a mere emotional plea. She had reminded him of his conscience, forced him to face the humanity he had tried desperately to deny, but she also recognized that Drew's transformation might have gone too far, his newfound ruthlessness too deeply embedded to simply vanish overnight. Elizabeth felt the tension building between them, silence hanging thickly in the air as Drew wrestled with his conflicting emotions. She knew her battle wasn't over yet, that Drew's hesitation might only be temporary, a fleeting pause before he doubled down on his ruthless intentions. But Elizabeth refused to retreat or show weakness. She stood her ground with unwavering determination, prepared to continue confronting Drew at every turn, no matter the consequences. If she could reach even the smallest fragment of the man Drew had once been, Elizabeth was willing to endure whatever pain this confrontation might cause her. In that charged silence, Elizabeth silently vowed to remain steadfast, fiercely resolute in protecting those around her, even if it meant sacrificing whatever fragile piece she had finally begun to rebuild in her own life. Nevertheless, Elizabeth resolved that she would never surrender, no matter how difficult or dangerous her battle with Drew became. Standing alone in the quiet darkness of her apartment, she repeated the promise to herself, a silent vow spoken in the privacy of her own heart. She would do whatever it took to protect Portia and Trina, even if it meant directly confronting and challenging the man she had once wholeheartedly loved and trusted above all others. Elizabeth understood clearly the magnitude of the struggle she was about to face. Drew was no longer merely a figure from her past, he had become a formidable threat, driven by ambition and entangled in a web of lies so complex that it frightened her. Yet, Elizabeth also recognized that in the midst of this swirling storm of deceit and danger, the stakes were far greater than her own feelings or safety. It wasn't only about Portia or herself, but about protecting Trina, an innocent young woman whose entire future hung precariously in the balance. The thought of stepping into direct confrontation with Drew filled Elizabeth with a deep sense of apprehension, yet alongside that fear rose a determination she hadn't known she possessed. Her heart pounded with nervous anticipation, but her resolve hardened, pushing away any lingering doubts. She recalled clearly all the painful moments she had already endured, the bitter accusations, the betrayal, and the harsh judgment she faced. But instead of weakening her, these memories now served as fuel for her courage. Elizabeth knew that to stand idly by, to do nothing in the face of such blatant injustice, would betray everything she believed in. She pictured Portia's frightened eyes, Trina's innocence, and the countless lives already damaged by Drew's manipulation. Each image reinforced her conviction, compelling her to act, to fight for justice, no matter the personal cost. Elizabeth had long ago learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. She acknowledged the pain that would inevitably come from facing Drew head-on, but willingly accepted it as part of her mission, a sacrifice she would make without hesitation. As Elizabeth finally stood ready to act, her heart steady and her mind clear, she embraced the difficult path ahead. Whatever darkness awaited, she would face it head-on, empowered by the unwavering conviction that justice and truth were worth fighting for, no matter how challenging or painful the battle might become.